Hey everyone, welcome back to a hardware news recap. We're going to talk about the last week in hardware with an initial note on some Coffee Lake follow-ups. So when I did the review, we talked about how we didn't really know what the pricing and availability would be yet because reviews are obviously filmed before the thing goes up for sale. So now we know. We can talk about that a little bit. I've got some news on Z370 motherboards. Inno3D has a 768 CUDA core GTX 1060. That's kind of interesting. It's normally 1280 CUDA cores for reference. And then some other industry news, like the death of AOL Instant Messenger. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly, makers of the Conductonaut liquid metal that we recently used to drop 20 degrees off of our Coffee Lake temperatures. Thermal Grizzly also makes traditional thermal compounds for use on top of the IHS, like Cryonaut and Hydronaut pastes. Learn more at the link below. So let's start with a note on thermal testing and Coffee Lake. We had thermals for Coffee Lake lidded and delidded, and one of the things I've seen online is people citing different thermal numbers from different review outlets, ours and Linus's and so forth, where one outlet like Linus I think got in the 90s, 90, 92 degrees Celsius, and some of ours were, I don't know, they were anywhere from 60 something to 70, mid-high 70s, depending on what test. The part that I want to pick a bone with here is that some of the comments I've seen online today, that we filmed this the day of Coffee Lake release, have been things like Linus got 92 degrees Celsius or Gamers Nexus got 68 degrees Celsius. That's not really how it works. Like, you can't just say, it's not a score. It's not like a Firestrike score. It's not a number that's assigned to you based on some one-click benchmark. Your thermals, as I'm sure all of you know, depend on basically everything. What frequency was used, what voltage was used, what motherboard was used. We published a whole video on just motherboard with different auto settings can impact the temperature, but more importantly, what cooler was used. And I'm not sure what every reviewer uses for coolers, I don't really check, but we used a Kraken X62 with max pump and fan speeds. That's what we always do for these thermal tests, just because we know it'll accommodate everything for the most part. And that means it's easier to check scaling, because what you don't want in our situation is to encounter a CPU that runs hot enough where your standard means of benchmarking in terms of coolers is not adequate, because if that happens, then you lose all that comparative data. So we don't like that. We use an X62. I don't know what Linus used. I don't know what anyone else used, but the point is that all the numbers can be correct. It's just, how did they test it? And even workload matters. So testing in Prime 95 28.5 or 29.2 versus 26.6, that alone can have massive differences, because your AVX workload versus non-AVX workload produces a different amount of heat. You start doing things like hyper-threading on CPUs, and now you're spinning off more AVX threads per core, and so your heat's going to be higher per core, whereas something with no hyper-threading would be lower temperature in that instance because it's doing one AVX thread per core instead of two or something like that. So application matters, all that stuff matters. So the point being that when quoting temperature numbers online, please try and keep the parameters somewhat in the quote, because seeing things like Linus got 90 degrees Celsius or Gamers Nexus got 68 degrees Celsius drives me a little bit crazy, because it means absolutely nothing. If I put it under liquid nitrogen and benchmarked it and said that we got negative 100 degrees, like, is that still a valid number to share? Does that mean Coffee Lake has phenomenal cooling? Because realistically, of course, the answer is, well, if it's under a different cooling element, then it's going to perform differently from what other people see. That's all I wanted to say about that. But another quick note, so going through some of the charts and stuff, we noticed that in our Coffee Lake temperature numbers for the Blender 4.9 gigahertz overclock with, I think, a 1.4 VID, or VCore rather, 1.4 volts, 4.9 gigahertz in Blender, the data referenced was in the incorrect column, so the correction to that is one we'll put on the screen now. The difference is 4 degrees Celsius. So, sorry, instead of 24 degrees Celsius cooler with liquid metal, it's actually only 20 degrees Celsius cooler. So, of course, that completely changes everything, except not at all, because it's still 20 degrees Celsius cooler with liquid metal. And actually, on that note, so I did some more looking into this. We show that Intel still uses TIM, obviously, as evidenced by a 20C difference in this particular heavily overclocked test. A 20C difference going to liquid metal versus TIM. They're still using TIM. I'm not 100% sure if it's the same Dow Corning stuff as always, or if it's slightly better. One thing I do know is that the die size is larger on Coffee Lake on the 8700K, and that means you're spreading the heat out over a larger area. Now, of course, it accommodates 2 more cores, so that die size isn't wasted, but it's still larger. And that plus a questionable change in thermal paste, questionable meaning I'm not sure if they did. Those two things together would account for the slightly better thermal performance in the 8700K than we saw in the 7700K that I talked about in the review, where basically it seems like it's just at least marginally better. And Der Bauer and I thought maybe there was a change in thermal compound where maybe they're using the HTC stuff that they use on i9s on the 8700K, but neither of us is really sure about that. Or at least I'm not. Maybe he is by now, but he wasn't yesterday. So that's all for the Coffee Lake stuff. Basically, temperature comparisons can't be done cross-site or even inter-site if they use different coolers and things. And the number 20 degrees Celsius difference instead of 24. So it's still worth doing liquid metal. One more thing, I guess. I saw a couple quotes online where people were I was talking with Patrick about this as well, who works on a lot of our testing. And we've seen some quotes online where people will take like data from delidding or like Noctua versus other tests, things like that, and use it as a bludgeon to hit people over the head with. And one of the things I've seen recently was delidding numbers for the 8700K being used to say, you need to delid the 8700K for it to be any good thermally. No, you absolutely do not. In fact, it actually cools pretty well comparatively. And delidding it really helps. Obviously, we would recommend it for really heavy overclocks. Even just getting rid of some of the silicone adhesive and replacing it with better TIM, you'll be in pretty good shape doing that. Or going liquid metal, you get our 20 degrees Celsius reductions. And that helps in a few ways. You get about a 4% power reduction for every 10 degrees Celsius reduction in temperature. And our 20C versus a 10 to 20 watt reduction in power leakage scales with that model exceptionally well. So that's a reason to delid and do liquid metal. Heavy overclocks are a reason. 1.4 plus volts, that's a reason because you start running higher power. It's also worth delidding and doing liquid metal because if noise is really important to you, you can use lower RPM fans to achieve the same cooling. With a 20 degree advantage and an overclock test, it's not always 20C. To be clear, this goes back to like you can't just say the number and call it a day. It's not always 20 degrees Celsius. It was 20 degrees Celsius in that test, 4.9 gigahertz, 1.4 volts in Blender. And if that's the kind of workload you do, doing liquid metal means you can use a cheaper cooler, a lower RPM cooler, or something in between and end up better off overall. But you absolutely do not need to delid to have a thermally sound 8700K. It's actually quite good, but that doesn't mean you can't improve it. So just kind of get that stuff out there. Next topic on the Coffee Lake CPUs. So pricing and availability. Microcenter. I've got a bone to pick with Microcenter now. What the heck? $500. The 8700K. Every Microcenter. We put out a tweet saying, what's the pricing and availability of the 8700K in your region? Got dozens of replies from all of you. Thank you. And every Microcenter screenshot I got, $500. Apparently it worked just fine because they sold out of them. But man, that is awful. This is like Intel. Intel's kind of in the Vega bucket right now, where pricing is insane and availability is nil. And who's to blame for it? It's probably a mix of retailers, distributors, suppliers, and Intel. Just like AMD's issues are a mix of AMD, distributors, suppliers, and retailers, I guess. So, yeah, basically, we've dug into this a bit. So, I don't know how many units were available. I don't know if it was just like this thing was tremendously desired and so sold out immediately, or if it was genuinely low stock. Everything I've heard from the industry is low stock. Part of the leak we got a couple of, I don't know, a week or two ago when we published that leak of the H series 300 motherboards coming out Q1 next year. That was sent to me. Part of that, I got information from a supplier where a very small percentage, let's just go with, 10% basically. So 10% of all CPUs going into the country that originated that email to me, 10% of their CPUs, it was a non-US country, were going to be 8th generation Coffee Lake CPUs in Q4. So meaning 90% are Kaby Lake, Skylake, whatever's left. And we also heard that allocation was pretty small, and some retailers and some suppliers were only allowing Coffee Lake sales with the rest of a system, sort of like an SI deal, where you see it with Vega too, where you might be able to get the part more easily by going through someone like iPower or CyberPower or one of them, because there's more allocation to them as opposed to standalone part sales. So availability is definitely not great, but I don't know how bad it is or if it's just genuine super high interest. What we do know is the pricing. Newegg had it for about $20 over the 1K unit pricing, which was, I think, 350s, 360, something like that. So Newegg was selling in the 370, 380 range, and a $20 uptick on 1KU pricing is not unreasonable. That's pretty normal, actually. So their pricing was fine, but they're out of stock. Amazon has some i5s in stock. They didn't have 8700Ks when I checked, but they sold out of everything by now for sure. And generally, pricing was plus or minus $100 globally from the US $370 price, ignoring Microcenter's absolutely absurd pricing. But yeah, so pricing seems more or less okay within what you normally see. If some of you have absolutely outrageous prices in your region, let me know below. Obviously, I can't keep an eye on every region, but from what I've seen, it's more or less okay. It's just there's no availability. And this might be of interest. I called a few retailers posing as a customer, including Microcenter, a couple Microcenter locations around the US, and all of them told me to expect inventory in about 2 weeks. Newegg told me a window of 2 to 4 weeks, and obviously they think they're talking to a customer here, so they're going to say more. But I emailed Intel as well and asked about availability and pricing, and Intel provided the following quote: "On your question, the 8th generation Intel Core desktop processors and systems are on sale globally. We are actively working with our retailers to fulfill strong interest from customers on the Intel Core i7-8700K SKU." So absolutely nothing of use, which is basically every statement I ever get out of Intel. Yes, it's some of the people there are great to work with, but when it comes to getting a statement, it's always as tight-lipped as possible. So that statement is exceptionally useless. Basically, they're saying, we're trying to sell the product we just made. So, big surprise. Let's move on to the next topic. The next topic, vendors are readying Z370 motherboards. EVGA is on the list. They have the Z370 Classified K, Z370 FTW, Z370 Micro. And as for EVGA's boards, the FTW and Micro boards are both 10+1 phase designs. Neither has RGB. And the Classified K has RGB. It's also got a killer NIC and has a 12+1 phase VRM. So that's the difference there. The FTW is $199 or $200 MSRP, and to be determined on the other two. For differences between the FTW and Classified K, other than the VRM, we can kind of toggle between the images, and it's basically playing the game of spot the difference. There aren't many, but the Classified K does have an extra 4-pin power header and some other small changes across the board. Other than these, ASRock, Asus, and Gigabyte have also all, of course, shown or released their boards at this point. The reason for 300 series chipsets, as we published previously, is that they have a different power delivery subsystem for the high core count chips and just for Coffee Lake in general, because, I mean, they're different. They have different needs. To date, ASRock, Asus, Gigabyte, MSI, and BioStar have all outed some of their Z370 motherboard offerings, and we can kind of go through the pictures here, but for the most part, they're not there's not too much we can talk about yet until we can actually see the VRMs of these things or remove some of the heat sinks and look at them. The next news item is from Inno3D. Inno3D has a new headless video card they're trying to release, which headless means in this context that there's no display out on it. So they are looking at doing headless GTX 1060s, no display out. They're going to have GP106, the GPU, but it's modified. It has the same 192-bit memory bus. However, it's going down to 768 CUDA cores from 1280. So that's actually really interesting to me. And I'm not sure where they're getting the GPUs. I don't know if it's like they can buy these GPUs from NVIDIA that have more or less been thrown in the trash bin that have functional memory buses, but half their cores are not working. If that's the case, they should be cheaper. But otherwise, basically they're targeting miners who want the memory bandwidth, don't care about the cores, can run a 75 watt TDP instead of whatever the original was, a bit higher for sure, and then get rid of display outs and reduce cost overall. So that should be pretty interesting, but I don't know. It's not really my market, so we'll see. I'm most curious about how they get the GPUs, the chips, and if they're actually cheaper from NVIDIA that way, or if they're buying proper GP106s and then it's disabling stuff, which doesn't seem like it'd make a lot of sense. Next one is some industry stuff. So USB-IF published their USB 3.2 Type-C specs recently. That's targeting a 20 gigabit per second bandwidth, and it was originally announced back in July. The USB Implementers Forum now published the newest version of the USB specification. 3.2 will double the bandwidth of USB 3.1 Gen 2 for a maximum bandwidth of 20 gigabits per second or 2.5 gigabytes per second. The new USB 3.2 hosts and devices will use a multi-lane operation using existing certified 10 gigabit per second Type-C cables to achieve the new speeds. And in product news, Cooler Master is debuting a new budget family of power supplies in the MWE series. These new supplies will offer capacities from 450 to 650 watts with 5 models in total. All models are 80 plus bronze, certified and non-modular. The PSUs adhere to the ATX form factor, have a 100,000 hour MTBF minimum, and offer over voltage, over power, over temperature, over current, and short circuit protections. The price range is $50 to $70. Finally, Steelseries has a new keyboard, the Apex 150. That's aimed at those who like membrane keyboards and want to be able to spill coffee on them. The Apex 150 has water resistance and 2 drainage cavities built into it, so they've gone a bit hardcore with that. Apex 150 uses Steelseries' proprietary quick tension system to deliver membrane switches that are rated for 20 million key presses and deliver a quick actuation and tactile feel. The Apex 150 also has 24 key rollover, RGB lighting, and Discord integration, whatever that means. The Apex 150 should be at $50 sometime in October. And then finally, AOL Instant Messenger is dead, so that's sad, I guess. It was truly pretty revolutionary back when it came out, but yeah, that one's gone. Other news, Star Citizen has 3.0 alpha out for the Evo Kadi at this point. So the very early beta testers now have access to 3.0 alpha. I'm sure a lot of you at this point have no idea we've ever covered Star Citizen. For probably since about 2012 we've been covering it, originally in articles only. We have a whole playlist on the channel with probably like 40 videos in it, almost all of which are interviews with different people at the company. And we've been covering it over the years. It's gotten a lot less coverage this year because it's basically impossible to get a hold of Chris at this point, Chris Roberts or anyone else, because they've had their heads down working on the game. So you've heard about 3.0 alpha a bit now if you watched our previous reviews, or interviews rather, which were at CitizenCon. And it looks like it's finally rolling out to early beta testers, or alpha testers in this case. So yeah, I don't know. We'll try and follow it. It's kind of hit a slowdown lately, but once there's something more substantial to do with Star Citizen, we'll be doing it, hopefully benchmarking. That's all for now. You can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly as always, or you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a shirt like this one. We also have hats now, or we'll have them back in stock soon. There were only 4 or 5 originally. Got more made, so those will be back on the store. And subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.